In this clip, we are going to discuss objective hexes, and specifically what it means when one is declared or not declared. When a player initiates an offensive operation, meaning a hasty attack or assault operation, he has the option to declare an objective hex for that operation. The objective hex must contain an enemy unit. Any hex on the map can be declared an objective hex with no requirement that it be observed or acquired, unless the operation is an air-mobile operation. In that case, the objective hex must be observed or acquired. There is also no requirement that a player declare an objective hex at all, but it is the only hex that units participating in an offensive operation can fire at. If no objective hex is declared, then the participating units will not get to fire. However, the enemy player always gets defensive fire against units participating in an offensive operation, regardless of whether an objective hex has been declared or not. If an objective hex has been declared, the enemy player is allowed to react a force into that objective hex during the reaction step. Reaction is covered in another clip. However, if no objective hex is declared, then no reaction is allowed. There is also no requirement that the active player move any of his participating units anywhere near the objective hex. He is free to move his units in any direction that he desires. However, again, the objective hex is the only hex that he can fire at. There are many good reasons why a player might not declare an objective hex. I want to discuss two that might not be obvious. The first is that a player might not declare an objective hex because he intends to bypass a position. He needs to declare an offensive operation to be able to move next to the enemy unit, but he has no intention of remaining there long enough to shoot at it. So, in this example, the Warsaw Pact player has declared that he is executing a hasty attack operation with the 170th Guards Motor Rifle Regiment. He declares no objective hex. Instead, he moves his first unit, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and his second unit goes 1, 2, 3, 4, accepting infiltration fire in this hex, which kills the step. The unit then goes 5, 6 to here. The Warsaw Pact player completes the operation. He never declared an objective hex because his objective was to work his way around that position, not hit it by frontal attack. Another good reason not to name an objective hex is that enemy infantry and engineers are doubled for defensive fire when they occupy an objective hex containing close terrain, meaning heavy woods, rough, town, or city hexes. So, if this regiment here were to execute a hasty attack and name this hex as its objective, then when this German unit executed defensive fire, it would be firing at double its normal strength. On the other hand, if the regiment moves into this hex but does not name an objective hex, then the enemy infantry unit would still get defensive fire, but it would not be doubled. The regiment has taken the town, but it is not trying to attack into the city this turn. On the following turn, the regiment could now observe the adjacent enemy infantry unit and possibly call in a massive fire strike if it holds its ground. If an objective hex proves to be empty, either because the units in the hex were all dummies, or because it contained a unit that successfully screened and then retreated out of the objective hex, the active player can always declare another objective hex right in the middle of the operation. There is no limit to the number of times this can happen in a single operation. So in this example, the 51st Guards has declared a hasty attack operation, and the Warsaw Pact player names this hex as his objective. He moves the unit next to it. On movement point, turns out that this is a dummy. So he declares that he will now make this his objective hex, and he continues to move 2, 3, 4, only to discover that this unit is also a dummy, and therefore he is now going to name this as his objective 5 and 6, and this proves to be a real unit. So the operation proceeds from there. If an objective hex is changed in the middle of an operation, the currently moving unit can continue with its movement unless it was successfully screened, including moving into the prior objective hex. But the only hex that a player can advance into during the advance step of an operation is the current objective hex, and then only with units that are adjacent to it at the end of the operation. So, for example, the Warsaw Pact player declares that he is executing a hasty attack operation with the 241st Guards Motor Rifle Regiment. He names this as his objective hex. He then moves 2 movement points, only to discover that this unit is a dummy. So he now names this as his objective hex, and moves 3, 4 into an adjacent hex, only to discover that, again, this NATO unit is a dummy. He now faces an interesting decision. He has spent 4 movement points so far, so he lacks the movement points to move into the objective hex. If he leaves the objective marker where it is, he can advance into that hex during the advance step of the operation. On the other hand, he could change the objective to this hex. He has the 2 movement points required to actually reach it. On the other hand, if he does this, even if he were to split this unit into 2 and leave part of it behind, he will not be able to advance into this hex because it is no longer the objective hex. So he has to make a choice between advancing into this hex or making an attack on this hex. In the event, the Warsaw Pact player decides that the better course of wisdom is to advance the entire unit into the objective hex. And this concludes our clip on objective hexes.